There's just something captivating about a dead mall. You know what I'm talking about, right? You've seen them in YouTube videos. Hell, at this point in time and at this point in the country, you've probably got at least one in your city. Those malls are still open to the public, still technically operational, but nearly completely devoid of all signs of life. The corridors are mostly dim. Lonely synthetic plants stand alone and cast dark, twisted shadows over tiled floors and dried up wishing fountains. You don't really see many employees, no security guards and no management. No one keeping an eye on things. Maybe something like only 3 stores out of 30 are still open, the last survivors of some apocalyptic event. Looking at these places and being inside one gives you an incredibly elegiac feeling. Well, it gives me one anyway. I can't shake the aura that something had died. Something that used to be here and isn't anymore. Something is gone. Not just the businesses and people though, but something deeper. More. Your childhood, the good times, a sense of hope. It's a little dramatic, I know, but I just remember being a kid, going to the mall with our dad was an event, the toy shops, the food court, and all the sounds and sights. One mall we went to sometimes growing up even had a carousel, and it was like being in some endless world. Going to those same places that were once so vibrant and full of life, and seeing nothing but shuttered shops, a carousel that clearly hadn't run in years, and a husk, it just hurts. The simpler times are gone and they're not coming back. And now they're replaced with something cold and empty. Only, and I learned this the hard way, in the worst way, sometimes it's not so cold, not so lifeless, not so empty. Something can take shape in those places. Wrong and horrible and monstrous aren't even the words for it. Our words can't do it justice. It doesn't belong. Kyle, I'm so sorry. Nothing I can do or say or write will ever fix it. But every time I feel that itch on the empty space where my right arm used to be, where my phantom limb sears with hot pain, I think of you. And maybe telling the story will help in some way. Going to explore the mall had been my idea. Nothing much had been going on that day. Kyle and I were just loafing around in my dorm playing fighting games. And Kyle, he came to visit all the time back then. My brother and I had always been close, growing up with a turbulent home situation, fumbling through adolescence and our early teen years with the dances and boyfriends and girlfriends and underage drinking and all the wild shit kids get into. We were the one constant in each other's lives. It wasn't something that was going to change just because I was going to school 2 hours away from our hometown, where Kyle still lived with our mum. Kyle was about to graduate, and he'd saved up some money from his part-time movie theatre job to buy a piece of shit used car. Religiously, Kyle would drive that car from Mum's ranch in Vernon all the way to the university nearly every weekend. There was only a 3-year age difference between us, and so I could relate to Kyle's life as someone who was about to enter the cold and unforgiving system of higher education. I had been right there with him at Vernon High only a few years prior. We'd gone to a party the previous night. I was pretty sure Kyle had hooked up with my roommate Tammy, and it skeezed me a little. Tammy was a cool enough person and we had become pretty good friends in our time living together. I wasn't about to criticize or try to control whose pants my friends or my brother got into. But as Tammy lay silently barricaded in her room, ostensibly sleeping off the events of the previous night, I pondered whether a fling between the two of them had the potential to complicate 2 important relationships in my life. I was nursing a bit of a hangover, and watching the digital forms of King and Paul Phoenix punch each other in the head had started to make my eyes hurt. I put the controller down. "Kyle," I said, "this is boring. I'm bored." He rolled his eyes. "You always say that when you're losing." He was right. I did always say that when I was losing. "Well, yeah, you're right, you win. I'm a loser and it's boring." He shrugged and set his controller down as well. I could go for some food. He phrased the statement more like a question. Nah. We devoured a greasy hangover breakfast not 2 hours ago. Kyle shrugged again, apparently now out of ideas. I don't know what made me think of it. I'd had a mild fascination with a YouTube channel that catalogued dead malls and had explored one a few states over on a trip with some friends one holiday break my first year of school. It was like I said earlier, there was something so fascinating and simultaneously powerful and mournful about these places. Even still, I couldn't tell you what caused me to make the suggestion that day. I think about it a lot. An unhealthy amount. How different things would be if I hadn't blurted it out. Hey, I sat upright from my lounging position on the sofa. What about that old mall Dad used to take us to all the time? Kyle raised an eyebrow. You remember, it was like just outside of town. On our weekends with him, we'd always go up there at least once. Granite Path Mall. Kyle chuckled. God, Joe, we haven't been there since I was 10? 11? Right when Dad stopped coming around. I nodded. I know. But I've driven by it a few times, Going into town on the holidays or to visit Mum or whatever. Place looks almost completely bombed out. I think most of the stores in there are shut down. It's quite a dead mall. Kyle rolled his eyes again. Oh yeah, like the YouTube videos, I confirmed. And you want to go there? You want to drive an hour and a half just to go walk around inside a mall with no open stores? We're already doing nothing. I tossed a throw pillow at him. Well, isn't there something kind of interesting about going to this place that used to be so alive and now it's not? And that Chinese place where we used to always eat. We can take some cool pics and I'll drive. Kyle laughed derisively. Interesting or depressing? Oh yeah, right. I forgot those two words are interchangeable in Josephine's world. Before I could retort, the sound of Tammy's bedroom door swinging open interrupted our conversation. My friend stumbled out of her room, her hair a rat's nest, and looking how most college kids look after too much fun. Kyle's face instantly went bright red as Tammy dismissively and quickly waved one hand and grunted at us, making her way into the kitchen for a glass of water. I laughed and Kyle chuckled nervously. Hey Tammy, I called to her. Want to go explore a dead mall? She held one finger up to me and guzzled the water, streams running from the corners of her mouth down to her chin. Tammy let out a satisfied breath as she finished her drink, finally answering. Sure, though can we stop for a cubic litre of coffee on the way? Turning back to face Kyle, I raised my eyebrows and gestured toward Tammy. So? Kyle relented, throwing his hands up. Alright. Maybe it'll be cool. Pete's sitting around all day kicking your ass at Tekken. I grinned and Tammy sat down on the couch next to me. I noticed she and my brother exchanged a look that they thought was secret, a small smile passing between them. Tammy's green eyes lit up as she turned away and sipped her drink. Looking back on that moment, I can't imagine how I ever worried about whatever the two of them were getting into. It was so beautiful and pure and happy. One of the last moments like that, really. An endless wave of possibilities and outcomes fractured out from that moment, kind of like the way the glass spiderwebs on a shattered windshield. All the different worlds and timelines born from that moment, and I was stuck in this one, the one where Tammy and Kyle were gone. Not 2 hours later, I was bringing my car to a stop in the car park of Granite Path Mall. It was an easy drive. The three of us goofed off and bullshitted the entire time, carefree and careless. So you guys used to shop here when you were kids? Tammy asked as she exited my Sentra and closed the passenger door and taken a big sip of her extra large iced coffee. The tone of her voice was unimpressed and I didn't blame her. Granite Path Mall was looking even more run down than I expected. The facade of the building was nearly crumbling, with some of the glass panelling at the entrance gone and now replaced with large boards of wood. There weren't even any cars throughout the vast parking lot that I could see. Well, not where we parked anyway. The mall truly looked desolate, haunted even. At the time though, this thought filled me with excitement. The place was looking even more interesting than I could have ever hoped for. Kyle answered Tammy before I could. Yeah, Dad used to bring us here all the time on his weekends. We grew up in the small town nearby, and when our parents split up, he lived in an apartment complex like 10 minutes from the mall. Tammy nodded. She kept her eyes locked on the crumbling structure before us. It looks abandoned, she finally observed. I laughed. Hey, I mean, Carla and I haven't actually been inside in years. It could be abandoned for all we know. Yeah, I'm sure this place was a ton of fun back in the day, Tammy quipped. Immediately upon entering the mall, it was exactly what I'd wanted it to be. The 90s kitsch tiled floor alternated pink and green. Dim lights just barely illuminated the halls filled with empty storefronts, lacking signs and caged with long ago locked and abandoned metal gates. I started taking pictures with my phone right away, trying to get a perfect angle of the waterless fountain that sat in the mall's center court. Light poured over it from the sky dome above, and the inside was cracked and filthy. Tammy and Kyle were peering into one of the many darkened storefronts, trying to determine what place of business the empty shop had once been. In the distance, down the wing of the mall to my right, there were a few shops that looked to still be open, though from here I couldn't quite make out what they were. I wondered if any of the stores that Kyle and I used to love still existed all these years later. I turned to the faded mall directory that stood next to the fountain, hoping to get an idea of how the layout of the Granite Path Mall had changed since I was last skulking around in here as an angsty 14-year-old. A small part of me kind of hoped that we could still get that Chinese food. Something else caught my attention though. A smaller sign now stood in front of the directory. My eyes widened as Tammy and Kyle sauntered over to me, giggling. Look at this, I exclaimed, thrusting a finger at the small sign. Kyle and Tammy both leaned down to read the bright yellow words and bursting off a pink background. It was a simple sign really, loud and attention-grabbing, the kind of thing that would draw a little kid's eye. The face of a smiling cartoon rabbit with baby blue fur stared wide-eyed and grinning open mouth next to the text, the corners of the poster adorned with colourful eggs. "Meet the Easter Bunny, $5, the sign exclaimed. And in smaller text, the location. In Wing D, near the food court. As opposed to literally everything else about the decrepit shopping centre, the sign was clearly new. As in, it had obviously been put up recently as an ad for a currently ongoing event at the mall. Okay, we have to go do this immediately, I said. Tammy cackled. Dude, Kyle smirked as he spoke. That's so weird. Why would they even bother having something like this here? He looked around the empty building and gestured. Not like there's any kids around. I punched his shoulder. Why are you questioning such a terrific thing? Just think of the great pictures we're going to get. Some guy in a raggedy-ass bunny suit, alone on a cheap Easter backdrop in this post-apocalyptic mall. Look, we were going to go to the food court anyway. Kyle shook his head, laughing. Tammy piped up. Well, I for one think it's a fucking great idea. And honestly, this trip could be worth it just for these pictures. Okay, well... I thrust my arms in front of me, commanding Tammy and Kyle to get a move on. The once over I'd given the directory told me we'd need to head left from the fountain for Wing D. On our way to the Easter Bunny, I snapped a few more pictures of shuttered storefronts and faded tiles. The mall seemed mostly deserted that day, other than the employees who milled about in the meagre few open shops. It made total sense. What would anyone be coming here to shop for? Not this, I thought as we passed a strange and themeless antique store, which really looked to be full of nothing but big pallets of cluttered junk. Its gate was raised though, so it was open. The sign above had either burned out or whoever was working didn't care enough to turn it on. Picton's pallet sales. Far in the back of the store, visible through the entrance, sat behind a till in the dim lights, their form barely registering from this distance. If that was what was left standing around here, It was no wonder the shoppers weren't showing up in droves. This place was beyond life support. Anyone still shopping here was merely picking the last bits of decaying meat off of dry, aging bones. As we passed the food court, I grabbed Kyle's arm. "Hey!" I exclaimed. "Quick! Let's look and see if that Chinese place is still open." Tammy laughed. "Even if it is," Kyle said as I dragged him forward, "do you really trust any of the food in here not to kill us?" I replied with dead seriousness. I think I'll risk it for that General Tso's and fried rice combo." The food court in the Granite Path Mall was smaller than I remembered. It didn't take us long for us to make a complete inventory of the new offerings that sat before the uncleaned and overturned metal tables. Nothing in the food court was open. No Chinese food, no pizza, nothing. I sighed. Well, that sucks. When we were little, I sometimes looked forward to this damn food court more than anything else in the mall. "Wait, it was good?" Tammy asked. "Oh, I don't even really think it matters, to be honest," Kyle responded before I had the chance. "It's just the memory, right? What the food and everything in here represented. Like, maybe it's better that you couldn't try it now, Joe, in a way." I considered what he said for a moment. "Yeah, I really wanted that chicken." Tammy chuckled and Kyle rolled his eyes, and only a few feet down the corridor, I saw our destination. In the middle of a large open space on the floor, a patch of green astroturf had been laid over the cracked tiles. Painted Easter eggs of all different colours and patterns were stacked and strewn about. Some large and some small, they speckled the floor of the photo set. Behind the patch of artificial grass stood a large cloth backdrop and painted with a bright blue sky. In front of the false sky, behind a small metal fence and seated in a ghost white wicker chair, was the Easter Bunny. The costume honestly wasn't as ragged as I expected. The bright blue fur was clean and smooth, not dirty or patchy. His giant ears pointed toward the ceiling, one bent forward slightly at the very top, and he wore neon yellow overalls covered with green polka dots, whilst a patch in the centre was emblazoned with the initials EB. Two giant buck teeth protruded from the bunny's furry white muzzle, and from which giant whiskers shot off in both directions. The only thing about the costume that looked a little off was its eyes. The pupils of the giant glass orbs were each turned to stare in opposite directions. The Easter Bunny sat cross-legged. There was a large basket filled to the brim with plastic Easter eggs in his lap, gloved hands folded and looking straight ahead. Straight at us. Overall, it was actually a pretty cute, if overly dumb looking bunny. I turned to Kyle and Tammy and smiled wide. "This is even better than I expected," I said. "And these are going to be awesome fucking pictures." "Which one of us is going to sit on his lap first?" Tammy asked. We all stared at each other, and she touched Kyle's shoulder. "How about you, Kyle? Your sister can take some great pics to show your mum." Kyle laughed bashfully, his cheeks reddening slightly when Tammy's hand grazed his arm. All right, he relented. We approached the bunny on his wicker throne. Kyle gave an awkward half wave. "Happy Easter," Tammy exclaimed, throwing her arms over her head. "We're here for pictures." I stifled a chuckle. Tammy was the type of person who relished in being obnoxious for the sake of comedy. The man in the costume didn't speak, didn't acknowledge us at all. He just continued staring, head facing forward and eyes going in polar opposite directions. I looked at Tammy, then at Kyle, raising an eyebrow quizzically. Hey, I finally spoke. "Dude, can we get a picture?" Never turning his head to act duly face us, the Easter Bunny simply nodded in response to my question. "Hey, wait," Kyle said. "Isn't there supposed to be like an actual photographer? You know, someone to take good pictures of kids and stuff sitting on this guy's lap?" I shrugged. Maybe they don't have the payroll for that. I mean, everyone has a camera on their phone nowadays. Well, how do we pay? Kyle was right about that. There didn't seem to be a money pouch or another employee or anyone around to collect or process the $5 fee. The Easter Bunny suddenly stirred, and in response to Kyle's question, lifted a gloved hand and pointing down next to his chair. I saw that he was indicating a cheap dollar store grade bucket. It was faded pink and made of thin plastic, and a white piece of paper marked donations had been crudely taped across the front. "Well, there you go," I said. I took a $5 bill out of my wallet and thrust it at Kyle. "Pay the bunny and take a seat." Kyle shook his head, but accepted the money and took a step toward the Easter Bunny. "You sure I'm not too heavy to sit on your lap, dude?" Kyle said, laughing tensely. In response, the bunny simply patted his polka-dotted thigh, inviting Kyle to sit. Tammy guffawed, and I grinned as I raised my phone to snap the picture. Kyle dropped the money in the bucket and tentatively lowered himself onto the bunny's lap, wincing as if he were in pain. Once seated, he turned to the camera and gave a comically exaggerated and clearly uncomfortable smile. As I took the photo, the bunny suddenly leaned his masked face toward Kyle's ear, so close that his plastic teeth grazed my brother's face. I frowned, and Kyle's eyes widened before he leapt to his feet, stumbling over the set and kicking a plastic egg. "What the hell, man?" Kyle yelled at the bunny. The Easter Bunny had returned to sitting statue still and merely stared at Kyle in response. "What happened?" I asked, walking over to meet Kyle where he now stood back against the wall. He turned to face me, his eyes still wide. Wide with fear, I quickly realized. He whispered something to me," Kyle said. I frowned again. "But what did he say?" Kyle looked toward the floor and ran a hand down his face. My brother took a deep breath before speaking. He said, "I used to watch you all the time, when you were a little boy, from my special place between the walls." I looked at Kyle incredulously. He wasn't kidding. I knew when my brother was trying to play a joke. He was terrible at it, but the guy in the costume had clearly said something weird. I turned and scowled at the Easter Bunny, the photo display now behind us, but the man had returned to his previous Zen-like position. Maybe he was just messing with you, Tammy reasoned. She had sauntered over to the spot where we now stood and had heard Kyle's strange explanation too. Tammy shrugged. "You know, just wanting to screw with some kids who were taking the piss out of his photo shoot." "Joe," Kyle looked hard into my eyes. "Let's go home. Please, I'm not having fun anymore." I nodded. "Yeah, I guess so. We've got some good pics anyway. But you know what? I'm going to say something to that weird fuck." Kyle didn't respond. Instead, his eyes widened, mouth hanging open in pure, abject fear. "Kyle?" I asked. My brother yelled out, but not to answer me. "Tammy!" I turned to face my friend, who stood behind me, and saw it. Him. The Easter Bunny. He'd left his seat during our brief conversation and evidently had somehow silently snuck behind Tammy. I hadn't realized how tall the man was as he sat in that white seat. It didn't look natural, now seeing him upright. He had to be over 7 feet tall, towering over the three of us. Arms spread open wide as if he were about to grab her in a big bear hug. But he didn't. As Tammy turned to look behind her, the Easter Bunny swung his hands together, a motion of two clashing cymbals. As his hands met, Tammy's head was crushed between them, effortlessly as if it were a rotten peach. The Easter Bunny's blue suit was coated in a massive spray of vicious red gore, some of which was splashed backwards onto Kyle and I. The two of us were speechless, mouths agape in horror. The bunny stood there for a few moments, hands clasped together above Tammy's neckline, her convulsing body still standing upright. Finally, he drew them apart, and for a brief moment we could see the pancake-flat scrap of ruined flesh that Tammy's head had been reduced to as she collapsed to the floor. I was frozen with fear, my feet locked in place. My roommate's skull had just been flattened by a freakish man in an Easter bunny costume. The bunny began to speak as he pointed a dripping red finger at me, glove saturated with Tammy's viscera. "You two should come back. Come to the place between the walls and live here forever." His soft voice was tinny and strange. Hollow. The only way to describe it is that it sounded like he was speaking from somewhere else. Some faraway place, like the voice wasn't even coming from the suit. "You never should have left. I should have grabbed you back then." I snapped out of it, turning toward my brother. His face was completely drained of colour, and he poked his fingers around at the bits of Tammy's gore that covered his nose and lips. "Kyle!" I grabbed his arm harshly. "We have to go. Come on now." I clumsily ran my free hand over my face, trying to wipe away Tammy's wet bits. I physically pulled my brother and began running, turning to see that the bunny wasn't following. But he just stood in place and kept that finger pointed squarely in my direction. As we turned and rushed down the long corridor with Kyle still in a daze, something else was immediately wrong. The corridor leading from Wing D back to the main entryway had previously been short, a brief walk, but I noticed it quickly as we sprinted past the shuttered storefronts and fast enough that we should have already reached the dry fountain. But the fountain was nowhere to be seen, and instead we were simply surrounded by nameless and empty shops. Turning to look behind me, the food court and the bunny and Tammy's mutilated corpse were out of our line of vision. It was impossible. The corridor seemed to stretch on forever in both directions. No end in sight. "Kyle!" I shook my brother, trying to rouse him. "Kyle! Something's wrong!" But he just stared at me, wide-eyed. "I know," he said meekly. "Tammy." I fought back tears as I cupped Kyle's face with both hands. "We need to figure this out, Kyle. Something's wrong. We can't leave." He looked back and forth exasperatedly, glancing down both ends of the now infinite corridor. He turned to me with a look of pure terror. "I'm going to try and call 911, I said, pulling out my phone. But it wouldn't turn on. The screen remained black no matter which buttons I pressed. And Kyle's was the same. I threw my hands up in frustration. "What the fuck?" I exclaimed. "What the fuck is going on?" Kyle shook his head back and forth, tears in his eyes. Suddenly, in the distance, I heard footsteps rapidly approaching. From the way we'd come before, from where the Easter bunny was. Kyle and I shared a panicked look and immediately began sprinting again, forward into the endless hallway. I was starting to feel a stitch in my side, and Kyle looked breathless as we passed the familiar sight. Picton's pallet sales. In this nightmare world where we'd ended up, there the so-called antique store stood, door wide open. "Go!" I commanded, and Kyle listened. We rushed into the store and I fought to pull the glass door closed behind me. Toward the back of the store, a lone employee stood still behind the till, keeping a silent vigil. We rushed toward the person, screaming that we needed help. We came to a dead stop as we approached the register. Sitting behind the cash wrap, manning the till, it wasn't a person. I don't know what you call it. The thing had jet black skin, its eyes gigantic white orbs and stretched open wide with pinprick pupils. It had no visible ears or nostrils and appeared to be completely naked. Its mouth was a jagged slit that almost looked torn into its inky flesh. "Oh, what the fuck?" Kyle stammered. The thing stared at us and began frantically shaking its head. The flaps of skin on its face rippled as a voice escaped the creature's throat. Our dad's voice. "Look, Joe, things between your mum and I haven't been great." It was a pitch-perfect imitation. Hell, it almost sounded like an audio recording. And it was the last conversation I'd ever had with my father. "You and Kyle are the most important things in my life. But it's just hard for me to be around your mum sometimes." I shook my head in disbelief, and Kyle seemed downright catatonic, collapsing to the floor and hugging his knees to his chest. But before I could fully process what was happening in front of me, I heard the glass entryway of the Picton's pallet sale shatter and footsteps crunching over glass. The Easter Bunny was here. Tears streamed down my face as I turned to see the baby blue figure slowly meander towards us under the store's dim lights, and still daintily holding the wicker basket full of plastic Easter eggs around his wrist. Without even thinking, I grabbed an object off of one of the pallets full of junk nearest to me, an aluminum baseball bat with a $3 price tag, and swung it high at the bunny's head as he approached. I was surprised to feel virtually no give as the costume's head went flying and knocked clean off the tall blue shoulders. Underneath was nothing. No coal-skinned monster, no freakish homeless pervert, just nothing. Thin air. I dropped the bat in disbelief, gawking at the now headless being that stood in front of me. "Oh God," Kyle murmured in shock as he turned to observe the horrible sight. The headless bunny suddenly lurched down and forward, so that the empty naked neck hole faced me. It then raised its arms and stretching them toward me. As I stared into the circular abyss, a void so deep it couldn't have been of this world, all I could think of was the hollow emptiness of this entire place. How it felt to walk through those doors and knowing that everything we loved about the mall was gone. With a grinding, snapping noise, a ring of square yellow teeth emerged around the inside of the costume's neck hole. But not a neck hole, but a mouth. The soft voice came forward again, drifting from that empty hole and not sounding so far away anymore. "This is what's right," the thing said. "This is where you need to be." Suddenly, the massive creature shot forward and engulfed my arm in its maw. I gasped, trying to free myself as I felt a cold, numbing burn. I screamed as the strange tingling turned to outright pain, beating the blue-furred body with my fists and trying desperately to kick the thing off. And all the while, my father's voice droned out from the thing behind the cash register. Suddenly, I was knocked loose from the thing's grasp. I fell to the floor and saw Kyle standing where I had been moments ago. My brother had regained enough of his senses to stand and push me out of the thing's grip. He'd saved me. Of course, with this action, he'd planted himself directly in front of the creature. I made to extend my arm down to the floor and push myself up, but a sudden panic surged through me as I realized I couldn't feel anything below my right shoulder. I looked down to see that my arm was gone. It almost looked like it had never been there to begin with. There was no blood, no wound, just a smooth lump of flesh that cut off when my elbow should have started. Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ. I repetitively murmured to myself as I ran my hand over the unnaturally smooth nub. I felt my mind starting to slip. It was all too much. "Joe!" Kyle cried out but was cut short, and I knew what I would see when I turned back to face them. The creature grabbed my brother by the shoulders with its unnatural strength, and I heard something crack as its gloved hands tightened. You'll do.
The Easter Bunny extended its gaping mouth over Kyle's head. It was devouring my brother from the top down, like a cobra. I put my hand over my mouth to stifle a cry. "Kyle," I whispered. My little brother's body convulsed rapidly as the thing consumed him, slowly working its way down, the stinking fluid dropping to the floor. I knew that this was my only chance. I hate myself for it every single day of my miserable life. But I stood, and I ran. Tears streaming from my eyes, I ran toward the entrance of the store. I looked back one last time. I had to. I took that one final glance backward, just in time to see the bottoms of Kyle's shoes disappearing into that gaping maw. I snapped my head back forward quickly and exited the shop to the sound of my father's voice still calling out to me. "Come back, Joe. Josephine! Please, I miss you, baby." I realized quickly that the mall had changed again. It was no longer an endless corridor of nothing, no longer some alien world. Though everything looked even more rundown and dilapidated than before. Most of the stores were boarded up, trash littered the ground and graffiti on the walls. This didn't seem quite right either. But in the distance I saw the fountain, and in turn I saw the exit. I pumped my legs, subconsciously gripping at the smooth stump of my arm with my remaining hand. I burst out the main doors and collapsed in a heap, withdrawing my phone to try and call 911 as fast as I could, to try and save my brother. But I knew it was too late. The police arrived quickly, but they didn't find anything. No bodies. Not Tammy, not my brother. And they sure as hell didn't find an otherworldly creature that looked like the Easter Bunny. But they knew that something strange had happened that day. My missing friend, missing brother, and missing arm were evidence of that. But the story, of course, just didn't add up. Why would an Easter photo display be set up in a mall that had been shut down for over a year? Because see, the Granite Path Mall wasn't dying. It wasn't on its last legs. It had been completely closed. Empty. Abandoned. No one should have been there. No employees, no Easter bunnies. Nothing. Naturally, I spent a long time in an institution, for no one believed my story. And why would they? My mum never forgave me. She supported me and helped me through living with my new disability, cared for me in those early months and years of my total mental collapse. But at the end of the day, she thought I was keeping the real story from her, whether intentionally or not. The story of where her son had gone. The picture I'd taken that day of Kyle didn't show an Easter display or a costumed man. It just showed my brother posing awkwardly in the middle of the dilapidated and desolate interior of an abandoned mall. Every picture was like that, showing storefronts and tiled floors that were much more run down and ruined than they had actually looked in the moment. We had gone somewhere that we shouldn't have, and something was waiting to greet us when we arrived. No amount of drugs or doctors or anything could divorce me from the reality of what had happened. My missing arm was proof enough. Something had come to exist in that empty place. Or maybe it had always been there, waiting for its chance to roam free. But we had entered its world, so it had eaten my arm and eaten my brother. Those beautiful memories of the mall, a carefree childhood with my dad and brother, well, they were tainted long before that day. Trying to recapture them, even for a fleeting moment, twisted us into something somewhere that didn't want to let us go. I think about Kyle and Tammy every single day. I feel them when that familiar cold burn creeps down my phantom limb. I loved my brother more than anything else in the world, and it was my fault that he was gone. I know that someday when I close my eyes to sleep, I shall open them and be there again. inside the Granite Path Mall, in those long endless corridors, and face to face with a fuzzy blue Easter bunny in yellow overalls. And when he pulls off his head, there won't be nothing. There will be Kyle. There will be my brother's loving face. But wrong. Made into something else by his time there in that abandoned world with a thing that looked like the Easter bunny. But I'll stay there with him, in the place between the walls, the place where I need to be. I know this, and not only because I deserve it for leaving my brother there that day. No, I know this because some nights I feel Kyle's hand squeeze the phantom hand of my missing arm so tight, so desperate and hopeless and scared. I know that wherever Kyle is cold and lonely and dark, so far away. And I try with everything inside of me to squeeze back.